Welcome to this event, part of a week of events organised by ULLL, part of our Open Fora season on lifelong learning. And this week, our focus has been on diversity and inclusion in higher education. My name is Kevin Orr, and I am a professor at the University of Huddersfield. And once again, it is my great pleasure to be chairing these events. But I have to say, it is a very special pleasure for me today to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jane WORMALD. Jane is a senior lecturer in the School of Education and Professional Development at the University of Huddersfield. Jane actually began her career in contemporary dance and performing arts, but she is currently course leader for the part-time Education and Professional Development course, which is very much an example of our university's continuing education offer. And she is currently seconded to the Vice-Chancellor's office to help coordinate projects aimed at improving teaching and learning throughout our university. So today, based on her doctoral research, Jane will present enablers and restrictors in navigating careers in education in England and the role of policy in supporting aspirations to become a teacher. Jane, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'll just attempt to share my screen with you. 1 second, and we'll get started. I think one of the subtitles of the meeting here was what we have and what we need, and I'm making some claims here that I'm hoping will address some of those things, and I don't think it will be things that you will find dissimilar to the experiences that you have across Europe, even though this particular study was based in England. So it's a paper that I did as a mature student. This is my doctoral thesis, focusing on mature lifelong learners and their complicated and non-normative paths to achieve teacher status. There was a discussion earlier in the week what we mean by non-normative, and in this case I'm defining it as alternative routes to the mainstream, and the mainstream being school leavers going straight into higher education, doing their degree and then doing a teacher training programme, because that's unproblematical. It's what's been done for years and it's regulated, it's predictable and so on. The other offers of how to get into teaching are much more complex. And so I'm following, or I have followed 8 teaching assistants in their aspirations to become teachers. They've all returned to higher education as mature part-time students while still working in their schools. And I focus specifically on the learning lives and the educational experiences of my participants, and it was during particularly during a time of between 2006 to 2010 in England, where it was an era of unprecedented involvement and intervention in education from the government. The actual study, even though I started in 2006, the actual study took place much later on in the last 4 or 5 years. So I was speaking to those participants more recently than that. So what you will find also, and I've seen through listening to other people's discussions this week, is that the narratives narratives I heard also interrogated those areas that other people have identified: the social, the political, the economic or material worlds that these participants are living in, the geographic, the cultural and the historical, and all of these played a part. So I needed a methodology that was going to allow me to understand all of those aspects. So the format, what I'm going to do is begin by setting or continue to set the specific context of the study, look at the methods that I used to be able to ultimately deduce what I did, and identify the key challenges of these participants, and then move on to the findings of my study, which contribute to a call for stable yet flexible career routes to teaching, and designed for access across the life course. And then in conclusion, I'll suggest how policymakers really do need to recognise these diverse lifelong rights of entry to the profession, particularly if we're going to address the teacher shortage that's predicted. So let's have a look. The central concerns of the thesis were originally twofold. First, the quest to discover and understand transient educational policies interjected really for short-term gain that affected those on these new non-normative routes pursuing a career in education. Policy changed rapidly over this period, changed with governments and so on, and I'll show you an illustration of that in a moment. Secondly, it was about adding to a knowledge base on what's sometimes called second chance careers, specifically through the analysis of learning lives and those that have re-entered higher education. And then a third area evolved. This third area emerged as a methodological approach was explored, and this was in the usefulness of an approach to interrelate the structural, the social, and the individual aspects of their lives, and how those relationships intertwined and occurred. So I'm going to briefly show you the methods that I, or some of the methods that I use. So essentially, I started off with 3 semi-structured interviews, and these were across 4 years. But I also introduced, in order to just get a bit of richness to the data, and also it provided a means by which the participant wasn't just looking at me and telling me about things that are actually very close to their heart and about the way they felt. I introduced what a satisfaction grid, where they mapped themselves key points in their learning lifeline, and they then used a pen to draw up and down their satisfaction level at particular times. And as they did that, they talked me through why these were challenging or very, useful, happy, enriching times for them as they spoke. So this led to a layer that I don't think I wouldn't have got, and I didn't get in the first iteration of the semi-structured interviews. So I also, so that was a participant led, they led that mapping technique. And then in analysis, there was the thematic analysis, which is quite usual in this kind of study. And then in order to be able to visualize some of these and represent those visually, I used a couple of techniques that I'm going to show you as well, and mapped their experiences onto an educational policy timeline that occurred over the period of time that we were discussing. So I was then able to have a look at what was happening politically in terms of policy direction and where they were experiencing these different things along the way. And then using a framework called Careership Theory by Hodkinson and Sparks. It's Bourdieu-based, and it considers the agentic, the cultural, the structural, and also I paid more attention than actually they did to the temporal dimensions within changing contexts, and is an element that they call horizons for action. So if I just talk to you a little bit about careership theory, because it's something that I think has been really significant in trying to bring out a richer picture of these experiences. So it consists of three overlapping dimensions, one of which is the embodied positions and dispositions of individuals. So that's the individual perspective. It's about the relations between forces in a field and the field in which it occurs, i.e. the structural element involved, and then also the life course on longitudinal pathways, which is what they call this horizons for action, that change and occur and alter over time. So I rather, like that way of talking about what's possible within the fields at any one time. And that was really a good way of trying to analyze and unpick some of the data that I was seeing. So here we've got an example of what I initially did before placing anything to do with the participants on. I was looking at the kind of, and it doesn't matter that you can't see the actual detail on here. Basically what it is, across the top of the scale, I think you can see my arrow as well, I've got the different changes of government. So it starts off at the top here with the Labour government going into Margaret Thatcher and her Conservative government through to John Major, changing to the Labour government, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and so on across the top. And then underneath all of those, these are all just education policies. These aren't even all of them. These are what are sort of really significant to either higher education, or these particular teaching assistants were in primary, all but one were in primary education. So it was in relation to that. So it's only a part of, this huge amount of information that was, hitting teachers and the educational area at that time. So the ones that I've underlined in different colours here are the ones that as I've been talking and doing my analysis, have been the most significant to those particular participants, but it could well be that others were important to other people. So I think that one is sort of self-explanatory. I then started to look at the how the individuals are mapped, how I was mapping them and the times that they started being a teaching assistant. So for instance, down here we've got TA, which means this is when they started to become a teaching assistant. We've got the time across here. So the first one was in 2002, and the last one there was 2009. You see at that point that it followed from, and they were mostly getting these TA positions because of a policy that was about workforce remodeling in 2003. And this was a 3-year initiative where it was intended that teaching assistants were able to take over some of the teachers' workload in the classrooms and became classroom assistants. So that had a significant impact on the numbers of teaching assistants that were coming into the schools. So what then happens is that they were then encouraged to start a qualification. Now, these particular students took what was called a foundation degree, and a foundation degree is one that you can enter with minimal qualification. So it's below the level of a regular degree, and it will take you up to a point that is part way through. It's almost like the finish of the first year of a degree program. But they were promised at that point that when these foundation degrees were launched up here, that they would be able to complete the foundation degree and then do a teacher training year to be able to go into teaching. However, all that changed. So they started on this programme, they got to a point where they virtually finished their foundation degree, and then they were finding that actually, instead of going straight into a teacher training programme, that they weren't going to be able to do that and they had to get an honours degree. So they then enrolled on an honours degree. We had one at the university in which they were studying, and they had to then make sure that they achieved either a 2-1 or a first classification, which in the case they did, because they went on to be teachers. And then they had to negotiate how they were going to do their teacher training programs. So the change in terms of what these programs were also problematic for them. So there was a registered teachers program that was brought in at one point, but it actually ended really soon after that. A more long-standing one ended at the same point at which they were due to finish. So you can see the impact that had on these untraditional routes on which they were taking. So going on then to another sort of visualization of their stories, of their narratives, the charts that they used to show me, that they hand drew to show me their satisfaction, I was able to plot and then compare. So not only was I listening to the individual stories, but I was I was able to see how those connected to each other. And of course, my participants were different ages. So the way that I've collected this material was to show what they were, what their satisfaction levels were at particular times that they identified. So along the bottom here, all of them talked about these, milestones in their learning careers, in their learning experiences. And what came up, and was really, even though it came up in the interviews, what's quite stark here is this really steep downward trajectory here when they were at high school, and their poor experiences there. And they were for different reasons. Some because they said that they didn't think they were working fast enough, they didn't feel valued. Some because they had problems at home, which meant that it was very unstable for their learning environment. One became pregnant at 16, wasn't allowed to take her examinations that academic year. So things that one had spent a good time in hospital, and so had missed some of the her education. So for whatever reason, that drop at high school had significant impact on what they did next, because they found when they came out of work, they initially were pleased because they were able to get some work which brought in money, but soon got to realise that there was a ceiling to that they couldn't get any further without further qualifications. And this is when they started to look to go back into education at that point. What's the other thing that I found very interesting here is this whole sort of muddle of lines indicate a lot of turmoil in terms of what was happening at that time, from the high school, leaving high school, to becoming a teacher at the top here. And if we look at the simplified version, it could be demonstrated as being unproblematic, i.e. they started here at high school and then they finished up very satisfied in their having got their teaching qualification. I suppose what I'm arguing here is that that is not telling the whole story, so that when trajectories are used in this way, which is very common in policy making, that they're missing a whole lot of story, narrative, experience here that they really needs taking a look at before we can adequately provide supports and courses that will be useful across the lifetime in terms of education and becoming teachers. So in their narratives alongside that, there were a number of enablers and a number of restrictors that came up, and you will probably find these, you know, unsurprising in many ways, but what is important for this study is that it is empirical evidence rather than just feelings or what you kind of know already. So I was able then to be able to give some evidence to say that these things, well, for instance, first of all, with the enablers, there's the influence from significant friends or family with higher education experiences was really significant for these participants. So they had people somewhere in their lives that were encouraging them either to go back to HE or to say that, yes, you can do it. And some of those were the teachers at the time. Some of them were, when they started working in schools as teaching assistant, the head teachers encouraging them to do more. The parental attitudes to education seem to be important, in that maybe slightly misleading as it starts to turn out in some ways, that the parental attitudes to this particular cohort was that education will fix things. And in a large way, they have for these participants, but it's not been without problems. You know, the journey was extremely difficult. Yet they did have this background where parents thought that education was important and it was a stable career to have. I think nowadays it's probably less stable, but that was the way that they'd been brought up. And that the enablers also were in these in-service routes for teaching qualifications. They wouldn't have been able to give up work at that time. Some of them had 6 out of 8 of them had young children. They wouldn't have been able to do a university higher education course if it meant giving up work. Their peer support was really important. Their self-confidence and belief that gradually grew, and they became to be very important. The enablers of these non-normative paths were really important, and family and friends support along the way, and that's emotional and monetary support that enabled these participants to actually afford to do the courses in the first place. Now there is funding for part-time students. At the time when these students started, there wasn't. And then the limitations were in terms of the lack of support that they felt at high school. And really interestingly, they talked very much about being valued and not being valued. So they felt that if they weren't able to contribute the way the teachers wanted them to at school, in the timely way that they were requiring it, that they weren't valued and they weren't supported in school. So policy change and adapting to that policy change was also something that was really complex for them to navigate once they'd started on this route to being a teacher. And if they had a lack of family support or an inability to get that support, was also very difficult. And it meant that some of their colleagues, some of their peers who had tried to do the same thing were not able to make it along the way. I actually interviewed just those that had made it to teacher status, but there's a whole other story there about the restrictors that actually knocked people off the way on that journey. So I've talked about the ceilings in career development and the fact that some of the teacher training routes were unpaid, and this meant that they had to depend highly on, well, two of them did unpaid routes, and it was because they had husbands and family that were able to support them on the way. So here we've got some ideas that policy assumes agentic free choice and rational decision making. This doesn't completely tie up with the experiences and the outcomes that I've found here, and that experiences in a dominant neoliberal model of education and in the workplace that values functional competency and orderly behaviour outcomes. So it means that within this context, it makes non-normative career routes only possible when they're admitted to the field, but the experiences there remain challenging. So I'll just that's a summary of I suppose what I'd said on the previous slide. Some of the other significant points that came up were related to time and timing. This was in social, historical and chronological effects, what Hodgkinson talked about as the horizons for action. The advent of a very competitive neoliberal society resulted in these participants experiencing what is sometimes called time squeeze, and time squeeze particularly noted for women, and in this case the 6 of the 8 of the participants were looking after their families as well. The other 2 didn't have children, but they did have parental responsibilities. And also the fact that over a period of time over the life course, this becomes, things change. The balancing of risk and opportunity. Do we put a lot of money into the possibility of becoming a teacher? Do I leave now and cut my losses? Those kinds of risk investments was quite a big element that played into their the challenges that they faced. And I think I've also mentioned about one of the significant things for them as individuals was that they wanted to contribute. They wanted to give back to the society. They wanted to use their standing and their values to be able to use that in their jobs. And in the other area that was very significant was in that recognition from others that they could do it, and actually mitigating all of those structural features of which I've already spoken a little bit about. So I suppose what I'm saying here then is this detailed exploration of contemporary lives is necessary to address so that we can recognise some of what's clearly, very hidden or wasted talent that was noted by Brown and Hesketh 10 years ago, but we're still not finding equitable solutions today. And from what I understand, that's not just in England, and that's a much broader. And so what I'm suggesting is that we have some newer, more stable teacher education routes that are not just about what I've called here perpetuating homophilic education. That's, doing it the way that I did it, or, like me, that, often policy is based on when it's being developed by politicians. And these are the suggestions, the recommendations as a summary of the study. One is about having flexible, well-supported routes. One is about the cost effects of higher education participation, particularly for lower paid professions, needs to be addressed, because for teaching assistants to go through higher education on a very low income with very high fees, even if they can get a loan for it, is challenging. Attention needs to be given to change that affects diverse or minority groups negatively, and including mature part-time students. That there ought to be funded investment in access opportunities at different levels. That the risk threshold for entry to teaching needs to be met, and also raising the reward between investment and work-life balance, and considering ways of understanding the impact of constant flux in policy. Also, careers need to balance financial gain, time needed to acquire the qualifications, personal satisfaction, and meeting effective needs if they're going to be successful in recruiting the number of teachers that they need to, as predicted. Recognition of nuances that affect individuals differently at different times in their lives, rather than the expectations that everybody fits into normative pathways, which has been usual so far. And to value the intent for people to really meaningfully want to contribute to life and support these non-normative routes to achieve it. So I think what I'm saying here is there's much unrecognised latent talent in the workforce. There's a strong desire to contribute to society. We need some well-established routes across the life course, lower the economic risk, raise the reward, and recognise that contribution. And I think I've got to the end there. So I'll just come back to you on stop share.
Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you for a really fascinating account of, as you say, a very close investigation of these individuals, and then how these diverse and nuanced lives relate to policy. I'm going to ask people to put on their cameras so that we can get a sense of being together, and then I have some questions and points to put to Jane, but I would encourage others to do the same, whether in chat or just by raising your hand or jumping in. Jane, I mean, perhaps answer this for me first of all. Why did these women want to become teachers? What was their motivation to become teachers primarily, do you think?
There were a number of things. One of it was that they wanted to earn more, because being a teaching assistant, they loved the teaching environment. They liked, they started to understand the field in which they were operating, and they were being given good feedback from their classroom teachers and from the head teachers, and they wanted to be able to do more in that area. It had got something to do with earning more money for their family. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was about this contributing to society, and the fact that they felt at school that they weren't valued in any way in that particular area.
I think that's very striking what you find about school action. If I may, I'll come back to that. But I think many people will be struck by the huge number of policies that there have been associated with education in England, in the UK more generally, but especially in England. Jane, why do you think that is?
Well, I suppose initially it was the taking over by the, you see which side of the fence I'm on, taking over of the government of education, which is fine if there's some longevity to see some of these things through. But even within the same government, things were changing and continue to change. So there's just this turmoil all the time. And if you're not in the know, if you're not if you don't know how this happens, then you've got to have a lot of luck on your side to be able to ride those waves.
Yeah.
And these teaching assistants, before they came into higher education, really didn't know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's that intersection of the individual's agency and the possibilities that policy offers is so important and so central to your work. Carmen was asking if any of them were from minority communities, and if membership of those communities might be restrictors or enablers.
Well, interestingly, there was the one participant from an Asian background, and she actually stayed on at school to do, and she was going to go to university, but then she just was disillusioned and didn't. Though for her, she didn't have a young family. She was one of the ones that haven't had children, and so maybe not, what many people would think was typical from her community, but they did have a very strong, they held education in very, very strong stead within the family. She did have responsibilities with the wider family, and she also recognised that she was very lucky with her husband, because her husband supported her in doing this. But she said it not all of her friends and family understood.
Yeah. And those networks you talked about in that case within the family, but others have been so important to these individuals as well. Yeah. Thank you. Ole, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I jumped in the middle of presentation, but I wonder if you have, if the teacher training specialties or curricula are popular. Are there many students who want to be a teacher? Because in Estonia, we used to have quite a big problems recruiting students to these studies, and but our, I don't know, ministry, not ministry, but actually there has been different how to say it, initiatives, for example, young people to school, some campaigns, back to school, and also talent lives in you, bring him to school, and this kind of different activities. And actually, finally, I heard that this year there was enough students who applied for teacher training, and maybe also this COVID showed that this teacher profession is something which is just like important, and it's makes some I don't know, it's meaningful, because if the parents had to study at home with their children, they saw that it's not easy, and this somehow changed the attitude. But how it's in England? Is this popular?
Well, interestingly, one of the quotes that I've used in the research study was one where one of the participants said that her son saw her with her head in her hands, and said to her, "God, there's got to be an easier way to pursuing a career than this." So and yes, there are difficulties in recruiting teachers. There are incentives by the government, but again, they tend to be related to the younger cohorts, not entirely, but it is much harder for older mid-career adults to re-engage because of all these reasons. And I suppose if we could have a system whereby it's going to be not one that's going to be wiped off with the next government, that's going to be valued and seen as a good qualification, then that's where we really need to be, putting our focus. And there is clearly the course that I teach generally, that I'm course leader for, has people from all sorts of different walks of life, all vocational mature students, all doing extremely well, none of which did very well at school.
Yeah.
So there's clearly, you know, something there that says, you know, we've got a workforce out there that has a lot of ability, and enticing them into schools is tricky, because, you know, people my age, I've got many friends that are leaving because it's so challenging, and so, you know, this turmoil. So but I think there is a richness in terms of the community that's already within the school system or the college system. There is energy there, despite all of that.
Absolutely. Funny, I was sent something today, just some government research, which pointed to the huge problems there are, not just in recruiting, as you're alluding to, Jane, not just in recruiting teachers, but in keeping teachers. 40% of teachers leave within 5 years because of workload. So it is an enormous issue.
And I think with these participants, one of the things they did say was they felt that they knew what they were getting into, because one of the advantages of doing, each of them, from when they started their foundation degree to becoming a teacher, it took between, well, one of them did it in 6 years and the rest did it in 8 years. So this is 8 years of study, of paying fees, of, you know, time from family and so on. But one of the big advantages was that, you know, in Bourdieuian terms, they became a nurse in the field. And so they knew where they, you know, they felt they belonged to that educational environment by the time they reached teacher status. And so they knew what to expect. Whereas maybe those that have gone through university from being 18 and going through, it's much more of a shock and an immersion into it.
Thank you, Jane. Paul, so you've got your hand up.
Thank you very much. I would like to really say thank you for this insight into all the factors that contribute or that can make a difference in adult education, in education that we take on later in our lives, when there's already all other things happening, you know, including pregnancies, children, other jobs, lack of time and everything, and how much it is important that the motivation and the support of the family and the working environment is there. And it doesn't go only for the teachers. In Ljubljana, in Slovenia, we had this situation with the social workers and especially with the nurses. And it goes with increased demand for higher level of education in these professions. So it means when you are a nurse on a certain level, on a level 5 or on a level 6 of European qualification framework, and you would like to go up the ladder of the profession and you would like to learn more, it is so important that you know what is ahead of you, and it has to be also, in a way, it has to pay off. You know, if you pay for your schooling, if you go into your schooling and then you go back into the scholastic way of achieving levels of education, it is certainly a culturally different than when you are 18. So this applies to my knowledge and to my experience. This applies actually to many professions, and it should be taken into account in the policies and in the support, in the institutional and state support for these people who clearly have a motivation and a drive.
Yeah, and I think that, I hope that's where this kind of research is important, in that it does give some of those insights. I presume it's the same in Europe, but very often our educational ministers or people who are deciding policy haven't got an educational background. They've been, you know, they've done something else. They've been in other areas before they've been placed in that position. And so they're pulling from a limited limited experience, pool of knowledge
yeah.
that you fall back on things that you think are happening, but life's changing, family units are changing, genders becoming more fluid. There's all sorts of changes that we are going to have to start to adapt to, that can't assume the things that we used to assume, I think.
Well, I'm sorry, Palance, come in.
I just wanted to say that hopefully also this, a bit of this online dimension, open educational resources can also contribute so that people do not waste the time they need to commute here and there. This is also important because the day only has 24 hours for all of us. Thank you, sorry.
Yes, absolutely. I was struck by something though, and just reflecting what Palanta said, that you talked about time and timing. So these particular women could only follow this route at that particular time. Today, those same women or similar women, no matter how well supported, no matter how well driven they were, no matter their agency, they could not do it. The route doesn't exist. So policy really matters.
Yeah, it does. And so, now they're saying, where are we going to get all these teachers from? Well, you can't just keep churning out the same route that doesn't work. We need to have alternatives.
Absolutely. But the thing I did want to spend some time on, because I think it is so striking. First of all, I mean, this use of the satisfaction grid, the lifespan grid. Can I talk to you about it first in abstraction before we look at what you got from it? Why did you think it clearly was very powerful? Why was it so powerful, do you think? Was this able to reveal so much more than just a straightforward interview?
Well, I think I kind of alluded to it when I was speaking earlier, that what I found, the first interview I didn't use it. And what I was finding was, how do I get them to talk about much more about the way that they were feeling about things and what their experience meant to them? And I think this particular technique would not be uncomfortable or unusual for anybody who's been involved in teacher education or in schools, because we do such a lot of drawing on the whiteboard or illustration and so on. And actually, as it turned out, that was the case. They were absolutely fine in doing that. It's not hard. It wasn't a difficult concept. And I think also really in terms of their confidence as well, it wasn't looking somebody face to face and telling them how they felt. It was kind of diverted, so they were able to talk by drawing rather than telling you and opening their heart to you as they were looking at you in a chair. And I think it worked very well in terms of being able to explain that.
Yes, absolutely. Kind of a displacement there that they could,
a bit like, if you want to talk to your kids, you get them in the car sat next to you rather than face to face.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought that also interesting that you had the simplified version, which is the story with a happy ending. They started here but they got here, but the extended version just shows how difficult it was and how different it was for these individuals. But tell us more about this drop for secondary school, which I find shocking. I find, deeply shocking, the kind of hackneyed phrase, school days are the best days of your life. Well, clearly
they weren't for these.
Clearly not for
they
these
weren't for these participants. And I independent to this, I also am a course leader on the course that I mentioned, and we do reflect back on experiences, and that it's very much the case with the students that I teach as well, that their school experience was not a good one, and sometimes what they were telling me was that the minute that they got left behind in something, there was no room to catch up. So everybody moved on, and if you weren't involved in that shift forward, for whatever reason, whether it's because you were in hospital, your family were having difficulties, that you were abroad for, or whatever it was, that there was no room to be able to catch up. So therefore, it wasn't convenient. Even if teachers, I'm not making out all teachers are bad in that, but I'm sure lots of teachers want to help, but there isn't the time or the capacity to do that in large classrooms. So they did see school as a social place, but limited in that. But that's how they became to view it. And that meant that some of them said that they started behaviours in which, weren't acceptable to the teachers. And that all, got mixed up into them being seen as a problem rather than being able to be valued. And that sense of value was very important.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about it, after school, certainly within the UK context, especially within England, there is a cliff edge that if you don't make it by the time you're 19, it's very difficult to,
or even 16.
Or even 16, indeed. And I think, again, your research illustrates that these driven, well-supported women took 6 to 10 years to get to where they wanted to get, whereas if they had gone straight from school, it would have been half that time. I think that clearly this is the European, a network devoted to continuing education, but you can see how it does change lives. Continuing education provides a second opportunity, a second chance for people who missed out first time round.
Well, I'd be interested to see. Sorry, I'd be interested to hear if this is something that other people can, notice within their own countries.
Let me open that up. Is that something that happens elsewhere, that if you don't achieve, if you're not successful, at least academically, by the age of, 18, 19, possibly even 16, that you're lost? Is that true elsewhere?
In Austria, for example, the school system is really, really difficult because, like in Germany, you have either, like the secondary school, you have either you go to the gymnasium, so you go to the upper high school, or you stuck in the it's called secondary school. So it's and especially when you come from big cities, a lot of migrants or people with migrant backgrounds go to these secondary schools and won't make it to the upper high school, this high school at all. And this is from the year when you are 10 years old. So there's a decision which path you go when you're 9 years old. Can you imagine? And only the ones who get the best marks of A in England would go to the high school, and the other ones would go to secondary school. And in Austria and it's also in Germany, you have the dual system, which is after secondary school you can go to a school where you can make the Matura, the EBA, and you can also work, which is quite good in Austria. But still, the most decision is done when you're 9-10 years old. That's really bad. No, and this is when you become, when you start to become a teenager, and you start, with all your hormones, and then this is really difficult, I think. And the children is too young. In England, I know it's when you're 12, Ireland as well, and France are also, but in Austria and Germany, it's very difficult, and it's not good at all. Yeah. So, but this is very conservative.
Yeah, but interesting. Our policymakers look at Austria in particular and think, "Oh, that's good. We would like that."
I think it's the dual. I think it's the dual system.
Oh, it is especially the dual system.
This is extra. Especially when you work and you also can make a degree. This works well.
Yeah.
This works very well. But this is Anyway.
Thank you, Christina. Now, sorry, go on, Jane. I've got one final thing to put to you.
Just in conclusion, I suppose the people that I spoke to were those that did succeed. So can you imagine the talent and the bright people that are out there that could do this, but they just can't navigate that system.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, Jane, my final question is this: you teach mature learners. You have been a mature learner. How has this research informed your practice as a teacher of mature students in higher education?
Well, I think it's enabled me to have some strong evidence that that feeling of not being good enough, of lack of confidence and so on, is something that has emanated from previous experiences and that can now be taken aside. And in order to do that, it does take a particular way of working with newcomers to higher education in order to give them that belief, because I'm forever saying, you're here because you can do it.
Yeah.
You know, we know you can do it. Things will come and you know, from all directions, but we're here to get you through that. And so there's a lot of that kind of protection that's needed. Where we don't, where it's particularly difficult is when well, it's not been great with coronavirus, obviously, but it hasn't been for everybody. But illness is very difficult, and the extension system for some with really severe difficulties has not been the most helpful sometimes.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that's a good place to finish. The role of people who are committed to continuing education, and the role, therefore, we can play occasionally in changing people's lives. Thank you very much, Jane. I find that completely fascinating. As I say, I love the fact that you've looked at closely at these individuals and the environment within which they're in and how they interact. I think that's such important work. So thank you very much, Jane. Thank you to all of you for being involved. And tomorrow we've got a panel discussion, the last session of this week on diversity and inclusion in higher education. So tomorrow we've got a range, you can see a range of people on our discussion panel, including Jane, and we will be trying to answer that question, what we have and what we need in relation to diversity and inclusion, raising and trying to address again some of the points that we've discussed this week. So thank you all very much indeed, and I hope to see you again tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening. Take care.
Thank you.